Hello everyone, so this video is for the 50th anniversary of internment in Northern Ireland. It was Sunday the 9th of August 1971 at 4 o'clock in the morning when internment went into action across Northern Ireland. It was mostly targeted at suspected members of the Irish Republican Army. A few loyalist suspected terrorists were also picked up, although I think none that day. Anyway, so what was going on in Northern Ireland at the time? The Northern Ireland conflict is not spoken about very much these days because it's quite past tense. It's quite a good thing. It's a very painful topic, and it's probably better that people don't discuss it a great deal because it could reopen a lot of old wounds. I hope that's not wrong of me to be talking about it right now, in I hope objective terms and avoiding any incendiary language. So anyway, the Northern Ireland conflict erupted in 1969. It's debatable. You could say 1968. And people say, oh, well, no, there's been a continuous conflict for centuries. I don't quite agree with that. I mean, yes, there's been firefighting on and off in Ireland over the centuries. Sometimes there's been perhaps a century of peace and so on. But the modern troubles, as we know, is from roughly 1969. So Northern Ireland is a portion of the United Kingdom. And because the majority of people there are unionists and wish it to be so, a large majority are nationalists and wanted Northern Ireland to leave the United Kingdom and fuse with the Republic of Ireland. So there was a Parliament of Northern Ireland, and indeed Northern Ireland was represented in the UK Parliament. So the Irish Republican Army, IRA, was an illegal underground organisation dedicated to fighting the British Army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC. RUC was the police in Northern Ireland, and taking Northern Ireland out of the UK and joining it to the Republic of Ireland, also wanting to revolutionise the Irish Republic. They felt it was too conservative and too conciliatory towards Great Britain, not forgetting that the Republic of Ireland, that's the major portion of Ireland, we'd all been part of the UK until 50 years prior to that. Anyway, so I don't want to go too much into the background of just how we came to the situation in 1971, but there was quite a lot of violence in 1971. About 100 people died in political violence that year. So the British Army and the RUC were fighting the IRA on the other side, and then Loyalists are more extreme versions of Unionists. You could be a Catholic and a Unionist. I don't think you can be a Catholic and a Loyalist. So quite a few Loyalists are anti-Catholic, I think that's fair to say. And the Loyalist terrorist organisations were the UVF, Ulster Volunteer Force, and then the Ulster Freedom Fighters, UFF. So they would try to kill members of the IRA, but the IRA didn't oblige them because they're a clandestine organisation, didn't wear uniforms most of the time, had no barracks, weren't carrying weapons openly, weren't carrying weapons most of the time, were hiding them and putting bombs in places. So the UVF would then take it out on the Catholic community in general. Perhaps I should have said that most Catholics are nationalists and most Protestants are unionists. So if you're a Protestant in Northern Ireland, you're likely to perceive yourself as British and therefore wish to be part of the UK. If you're a Catholic, you'll probably regard yourself as Irish and not British, and more likely to want to join the Republic of Ireland. Now, by no means everyone wanted to solve these issues through force. There were constitutional nationalists who wanted to democratically achieve a united Irish Republic. Their political party is the SDLP. But anyway, the violence had gone out of hand. The RUC, that was the police, couldn't cope and met with increasing hostility from the nationalist community, some would say justifiably. And so the British Army came on the streets to try and act in a policing role, had not been trained for it and was often inept, sometimes heavy-handed. So it'd been not unusual for Catholics, even those who were of nationalist outlook, to join the British Armed Forces up until the early 1970s, but not so after the 1970s. Anyway, and so the IRA had some control of Catholic working class areas in Belfast and Derry, or some of the countryside like South Armagh. So barricades had been built and so on. There'd been Operation Motorman, where the British Army with tractors and so on had smashed down these barriers been built there to prevent vehicles going through. So the court system couldn't cope because there was so much violent crime. If you go back to the early 60s, Northern Ireland had just a couple of murders per year. But by 1971, as I said, about 100 violent deaths that year. These are people being killed by the IRA, by the UVF, by the British Army, the RUC, or sometimes persons unknown, and plenty of civilians getting killed. So it was decided this was an extraordinary situation. Habeas corpus simply had to be suspended to get the death toll down. There were shooting incidents almost every day, not necessarily fatal ones, and bomb blasts. So the extraordinary thing is, until the late 60s, Northern Ireland was an incredibly law-abiding place. The crime rate was actually very low. And so the RUC was stretched very thin, had to be expanded rapidly. People rushed through training, and they couldn't be carrying out ordinary duties, really, trying to catch pickpockets so much, or direct traffic, because their role had become largely a counterinsurgent one. Anyway, so it was decided by Edward Heath's Conservative government that it was exigent that internment be introduced. So they got lists from RUC Special Branch who were spying on the IRA, who the IRA members were, addresses were identified, and before dawn, snatch squads went in to a few hundred addresses across Northern Ireland, and people were arrested. However, the RUC's intelligence was often faulty, sometimes decades out of date. Sometimes the father and son had got the same name and they arrested the person from the wrong generation, or there was said to be one elderly IRA man who hadn't been active in that organisation for decades, and when he was arrested he found it deeply flattering that he was considered to pose a threat to the British state any longer. So of the roughly 342 people who were interned, about half of them were released within 2 days. Now, a number of them, I think it's only 6, were selected for interrogation in depth, which is now regarded as abusive, having to stand in stress positions, up against the wall, just leaning on your fingertips, hooded, hearing white noise, and on, things like that. But the British Army then outlawed hooding the next year. It was considered to be too cruel. The US military was using it over 30 years later in Iraq. So the British Army came in for heavy criticism for some of these interrogation techniques, particularly from the US government and pro-IRA groups in the United States. Of course, they don't criticise their government so much or even at all for doing the very same thing much later. But anyway, so some people were certainly abused in custody, and the European Court of Human Rights found against the United Kingdom in a case brought in 1978. This was inhuman and degrading treatment. So that was it, to try and get intelligence out of these men, and some intelligence was got. So these people were sent to Long Kesh, a former RAF base, was later turned into Her Majesty's Prison, the Maze. There were these Nissan huts, they could be accommodated there, they didn't have to wear prison uniforms, they weren't treated as criminals, they'd not been convicted of anything or charged with anything, and the Loyalist terrorist suspects were also held under similar conditions in a different part of it, and it was run by the army, not by the RUC and not by the prison service. And the IRA prisoners and the Loyalist prisoners, they would choose their officer commanding, and he would represent them to the British Army authorities who are actually running the camp. And anyway, so fewer people were interned. The British Army had warned the UK government it would look bad if only IRA suspects were arrested. So yes, some Loyalist terrorist suspects were arrested, very few. And some people said, well, that still looks bad. Now, the RUC didn't actually have much intelligence on Loyalist terrorist organisations. They hadn't existed really very long. They didn't mean UVF was founded as we know it. The modern UVF, the terrorist UVF in 1966 was tiny. And then the various ad hoc Loyalist thug groups in the early 70s, but were not very organised. It didn't require much organisation to go and shoot a random Catholic on a street in a Catholic area. The IRA's attacks against the RUC and the British Army, because they're attacking armed people, required a bit more planning and organisation, and there was more of an organisation to actually spy upon. So that's partly why the RUC had less information on the Loyalist terrorist organisations. Plus, they were not a threat to the RUC. They were not going out to kill the RUC, although I can think of a couple of cases where RUC officers were murdered by Loyalist terrorists. Well, Victor Arbuckle, an RUC constable, the very first one killed in the Troubles, was presumed to have been killed by a Loyalist gunman. Anyway, so the nationalist community was not happy about this. People shouldn't be held without trial or charge. Now, the Republic of Ireland had introduced internment. We'd had it a number of times If it had been introduced in the South at the same time, that would really have broken the back of the IRA campaign. There would have been the odd shooting incident, but it would have been far, far more difficult for them. Now, the IRA had anticipated that internment was going to be introduced, so a lot of IRA men had left their home, were staying in a safe house, had gone to the Republic of Ireland. When De Valera introduced internment in 1957, it had effectively ended the IRA campaign quite soon. There's the occasional attack after that. Anyway, internment was phased out by Christmas 1975. It remains quite a controversial episode. Gerard Adams was one of those interned. Now, the IRA men, they often put on uniforms, they marched around, they paraded, they said, "We are the IRA," when they're in the internment camp. So they could have been prosecuted on that basis. They could have been filmed. There was ample evidence. And there was also an amplitude of evidence that the UVF were UVF members, which is a crime in itself, and they should have been prosecuted on that basis. But anyway, the opportunity wasn't taken. So that's it. It's a contentious episode. Was it ethically justifiable? I don't think you can doubt that it's legal, because almost every government has done this. There was a test case about internment in the 1950s with Tom Mitchell, an IRA man, went all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. He judged, no, in a democracy it is acceptable under these extreme circumstances to temporarily suspend habeas corpus. So that's what internment was. Some people remember it bitterly to this day, and will protest on the 9th of August in memory of when people were held without a trial or charge. And some people say, well, it's so difficult to secure convictions in such cases. There's so much intimidation. It's very, very difficult to amass evidence, and the police were simply overwhelmed by the number of crimes that they've got to investigate. Other people say, no, it fatally undermines the very rights you ought to be trying to defend as a democracy. Anyway, that's enough from me, so please subscribe to my channel. Toodaloo.